today. We have wonderful content to review and discuss, so I will dive right in. Hi, everyone. It's my honor to welcome all of you to the Chicago Coalition for Family Building's complimentary webinar, Parenthood Pride, Navigating the Legal Maze and Fertility Treatments for the LGBTQ Community. Before we turn the event over to our moderator, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. Your camera and sound have been turned off, so you don't have to worry about any settings from your end. And at any time during the webinar, you can use the chat functionality to ask a question, as there will be time at the end for a Q&A. And don't worry if you've missed anything, the webinar will be recorded and shared on our Coalition YouTube page. We also want to thank Ferring Pharmaceuticals for sponsoring today's webinar and our webinar series. Before I turn it over to our moderator, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, beginning with Dr. Feinberg, who is the Chicago Coalition for Family Building's board president and founder, and a reproductive endocrinologist and fertility specialist and medical director at Northwestern Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. As I mentioned, Dr. Feinberg is one of the original founders of the coalition and is a fierce advocate for increasing access to fertility care. She will be moderating today's panel. And Dr. Kaplan joins us today. He completed both his residency in obstetrics and gynecology and a 2-year fellowship in reproductive endocrinology and fertility in Chicago. He has numerous published articles and presented topics nationally and internationally in the field of assisted reproductive technology. He has been honored every year since 1999 by Castle Conley on the list of best doctors in Chicago and America. Dr. Kaplan's expertise and passion in IVF, pre-implementation genetic screening, egg donation, gestational surrogacy, and egg freezing in the global marketplace. Teri Robins, our panelist, is an attorney and founder of TR Law Offices with nearly 20 years of experience in reproductive law. She earned her JD from the University of Cincinnati College of Law after completing her Master's of Business Administration at Columbia University School of Business. Teri is a member of the American Bar Association, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and the Society of Ethical Egg Donation and Surrogacy. Teri is known for her comprehensive legal services and compassionate advocacy in representing egg, sperm, and embryo donors and recipients, surrogates, and intended parents as they navigate the agreements and secure legal parentage, making her a respected figure in the legal community. In addition to helping her clients grow their families, Teri is an active advocate in support of pro-family legislation at state and federal levels. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Feinberg.
Thanks, Taryn, and thanks everyone for joining. I want to give special thanks to Dr. Kaplan and Teri for joining us today. Both of your involvement with the coalition is paramount to helping individuals meet our mission. And we have this unwavering belief that everyone who wants to start a family deserves the chance to have a family. Since our founding, we've been fortunate enough to bring 100 babies into this world, which we just celebrated last week. Yet we know that there are so many others that are out there navigating the path to parenthood, and we really want to help everyone meet their family building goals. Today's webinar is in honor and celebration of Pride Month, focusing on a range of topics pertinent to the LGBTQ community, from legal and healthcare barriers to the latest advancements in advocacy efforts. We're here today to have a comprehensive discussion addressing the unique needs and concerns of the LGBT community. And so without further ado, we're going to jump in and have a robust conversation. For those of you who may have questions, you can drop those questions into the chat. We're going to dive in. We're going to talk about a few things and then open it up for questions. So thank you both, Dr. Kaplan and Teri, for being here. And I think, I'm going to flip-flop a little bit between some of the medical considerations and some of the legal considerations. And I think probably one of the most important questions from a legal perspective is when we have a same-sex, let's start with a same-sex female couple, where both intend to parent a child. And I think obviously probably very similar for a same-sex male couple with both intending to parent a child, but yet there's only one partner whose gametes are used, and gamete is either egg or sperm. And so I guess my question from a legal perspective is, how do we protect that second parent in the parenting agreement, or what types of things are needed to ensure that both partners have custody of the child should the relationship split up? And how do we protect their right to be a parent and to be recognized as a parent when it's not a biological gamete or a uterus that carries a child?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me here. It's my honor and privilege to participate. But that is a excellent question. It's obviously sort of one of the more critical from a legal perspective. And it's really very state dependent. So in Illinois, if it's a married couple and we're talking about two women, and the one woman is carrying the baby, we have a presumption that both of the individuals are parents, and both names will go on the birth certificate. That doesn't work in other states necessarily, where there's not that presumption of parentage, perhaps, or if they're not married, more likely is the risk. But then there's also,
is there anything that's needed by both of those patients before they show up to labor and delivery, or can they just show up to labor and delivery, have a baby, and then get both of their names on the birth certificate?
so if they're a married couple, they just have to show up and get their names on the birth certificate. The complication comes if they travel out of state, or they move rather out of state to a state that doesn't give full faith and credit to the birth certificate that's been issued in Illinois. So a birth certificate is not the same as a court order. So if we're talking about two men who have used a surrogate, they'll have a surrogacy, or they'll have a pre-birth or a post-birth order, depending on the state, that requires their names go on the birth certificate. And that's transferable across state lines to any state in the US. A birth certificate doesn't generate that same kind of respect that the court order does. So with female same-sex couples, we recommend a step-parent adoption, or there's a secondary adoption. All of a sudden, words are escaping my brain. But it's essentially the same kind of thing, where we're recognizing that second parent for purposes of traveling to another state that maybe doesn't have the same laws in place.
And so what if the couple's not married? Like, if you have a same-sex female couple who is not married, will their names still show up on the birth certificate? If they show up on labor and delivery, what do they have to do in order to protect that second parent?
They would have to go through the second parent adoption process or recognition process, because the state law is just a presumption of a second parent due to marriage. So there's not that same kind of presumption. There would have to be some sort of proof that that second parent is in fact a parent. And so that's whether that's by relationship or by, you mentioned already, reciprocal pregnancies. I think that, that if it's the second parent is the biological parent, and the other mom has delivered the baby, then you can prove it that way. But there will have to be a court order at that point.
And so at what point in pregnancy? And so as somebody who I see these couples, I help them to get pregnant. And then typically the pregnancies are cared for either by an obstetrician or a midwife. Somebody is taking care of these patients from 12 weeks onwards. At what point in the pregnancy should they then seek the advice of a reproductive attorney to help navigate these issues?
So if it's a surrogacy, we recommend about 24 weeks to start getting the paperwork in order. In Illinois, it's really easy. If there's a surrogacy agreement and you followed all of the rules, and there's a genetic connection of one of the parents to the baby, we just file paperwork with the Department of Health, and we get the birth certificate, and that's pretty easy, unless we're worried about the moving states and getting some confirmations that way. If it's to women, it's going to be after the birth of the baby because it's an adoption, and we can't do adoption proceedings until after there's a child.
Got it. Okay. So if I'm understanding this correctly, in the situation of two women, you have to do a second parent adoption to protect the parenting rights of the non-birthing parent. And then in the situation of surrogacy, so two men, presumably an egg donor, and then one of their sperm, somebody else is carrying the pregnancy, they have a surrogacy agreement that allows them to be on the birth certificate, and a court order that gives them parenting rights. Is that correct?
Right. It allows them to be on the birth certificate. The court order is belts and suspenders, essentially, to ensure protection in any other state.
Got it. Okay. All right. And then what advice do you have to same-sex couples who are navigating some of the legal complexities of parenthood?
I mean, the consultant attorney.
Consultant.
I mean, our protections are getting better, but we still have a lot of room to go. So we have ways to help make sure that, that parents are on the birth certificate, like we, talked about a little bit right now, and we have ways to make sure that there's a birth order. Every state has some process that's some of them easier than others to ensure parentage. Michigan was the last state that criminalized surrogacy. So every state now has some sort of recognition of surrogacy, some sort of recognition of same-sex parentage that we can work with to protect parents. You just have to make sure that you are using an attorney that's ideally in the state where the child is going to be born. Sometimes, for a surrogacy arrangement, we'll have the surrogate in one state and the intended parents in another. There are states that will accept a birth order from another state, but it's important to at least have one attorney that's familiar with where the baby is born, laws, and where you're going to live, laws.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So if you have, let's take a same-sex male couple who's using a surrogate. The male couple lives in Illinois, the surrogate lives in California. When they create, so there's a few different points in time that they need legal contracts. My understanding is before implantation or before embryo transfer, you create a contract that outlines the surrogacy agreement, and we're going to come back to those contracts in a little bit. But my understanding is you need one attorney for that contract, and then you need a second attorney to help, or the same attorney if possible, to help with some of the parenting issues. And so in the situation where you have two different states involved, do you typically use the same attorney for both? And then do you follow the state where the baby's going to be born, or do sometimes couples have two attorneys, one to help initially with the contract and one to help with the parenting agreements? Like, what is normal in this realm?
Well, so I'll go back a little bit, and you said, there's a couple points. So if you're talking about a male couple that is using either an egg donor or an embryo donor, obviously we've got attorneys involved in that donation process first. And that can also be a same or different attorney than you're working with for the surrogacy. Typically, if I have a client that's in one state and the surrogate is in the other state, if I'm representing the intended parents, I like to have an attorney in both states. So, and then it's usually the intended parent who will initiate the parentage action. But sometimes, if my intended parents are in Illinois and the surrogate's in California, it may be that the surrogate's attorney that will do that because, it has to be done in the state. The state where the child is born is the state that's going to issue the birth certificate. So there has to be some action done there. But we can keep it to two attorneys, but there must always, I think you kind of touched on this, Every state that has a law regarding surrogacy specifically says there has to be 2 attorneys involved. We don't have any surrogacy agreements that doesn't have an attorney representing the parents and the surrogate spouse. I mean, it's one attorney for both, but the surrogate spouse is a party to the agreement as well, because of, it's a huge commitment for the surrogate and her family to be involved in this relationship. And also there's presumptions that if an individual, if a woman gives birth, and she's married, her husband is, or wife is the parent of that child. So they have to be involved to be waiving their rights, to be acknowledging the whole family's responsibilities there.
Excellent. And can you talk a little bit about when you do work towards a contract specifically for surrogacy, what types of things are usually included in that agreement, like very broadly?
Right. So there's compensation. We are careful sort of how we identify it. It's reimbursement for particular services, or for, not necessarily for, we don't tie it to the delivery of a healthy baby. We tie it to pain and suffering, or the discomfort, or the absence from work, or different things to sort of protect against any of the negative connotations that have been associated with surrogacy in the past, that I think we're getting beyond, but they still are sort of out there in some places. So we work on that. And then we try and identify any potential situation that can occur in the course of a pregnancy and make sure that we've talked through that. So key ones being, where delivery is going to happen, who has access to doctor's visits, who's going to be in the delivery room. And then, sort of most critically, who has medical control over the pregnancy, over the fetus, over decisions regarding termination, reduction of the pregnancy. And we try and get all of that out as much as we can, because the more we can talk about that in advance of the situation, the better. We're talking about it with clear heads instead of in the emergency situation. And then, we do have situations sometimes where we have different expectations or hopes. If we can get those resolved now, then we don't have conflict down the road. And our goal in creating a contract is to ensure as little conflict down the road as possible.
Yeah, thank you. I want to touch upon some of the medical aspects here as well. So Dr. Kaplan, looking at, I think let's first talk a little bit about same-sex female couples. So 2 different options. One is IUI, where a woman or a patient uses her own eggs and she carries the pregnancy, and then reciprocal IVF. And then we'll talk about male couples next. Can you just talk us through, like, what does IUI entail? How do women find sperm, or how do patients find sperm? And what is reciprocal IVF?
Okay, so it's, let me just take it a step back for a minute. I think there are, as a physician, you play a role in the LGBT community in providing 3 parts to the equation. Number 1 is we need to provide state-of-the-art technology. And if people forget that with all the logistics, you still need to have the best technology available so that that couple can take on a healthy baby as quickly, as efficiently as possible. So that's the basis of what we do. If you think about it, the technology we utilize in this community is no different to what we do on a daily basis with everybody. It's just a matter of whose eggs, whose uterus, and whose sperm we're using. So it's really a logistical factor rather than the actual technology really never changes. So that's very important. And so as a physician as well, you have to understand the patient and the couple, where they're coming from, what are their desires, how many children do they want. As a same-sex female couple, are they comfortable with the same person carrying the baby as whose egg source it's going to be? Or do they prefer one having the genetic makeup, the other carrying the baby? So you need to understand that couple well from what their desires are. You need to understand what their goal is and how many children they want, just like we do with all patients, because that's going to change the approach to their treatment. So my style is to offer all these options to the couple. They then make the decision based on their own personal relationship, what they prefer to do. Now, to give you an example, where we have to provide that medical information as well, because it's very important in that same-sex female couple. If you have one of the partners is 30 years old and the other partner is 40 years old, that's going to change very much the way you approach that patient than if they're both the same age. Because we know that what's critical in infertility is the age of where the egg comes from. That's the critical variable. The younger the egg, the higher the chance of pregnancy, lower chance of miscarriage, lower chance of abnormal babies. So you need to explain to that couple, if I could do it purely medically, I would have the egg source being from the younger partner, and whoever carries the child really doesn't matter because we know the uterus ages very little. Now, they might not be comfortable with that, but they need to understand from a medical point of view what will give them the best outcome. So you have to make sure you present all those options. And then when it comes to IUI is trying to be more physiological. So it's less invasive, it's less expensive, it's less intensive. And so what you're doing there is you timing when you're inseminating sperm directly into the uterus. So we either do that with a fertility drug or just in a natural cycle. We monitor the patient, blood and ultrasound. We know exactly in the month of a window of when ovulation is probably going to occur. And it's during that window that we inseminate sperm directly through the cervix into the uterus. That's what IUI stands for, intrauterine insemination. So everything is happening inside her body. We're just putting everything closer together. Now, it's easier, as I said, less expensive, less intense, but with that comes less efficacy. It's not as efficient as an IVF cycle. You don't have the pregnancy rate like you do with an IVF cycle. So that's what the couple has to understand. Are they interested in less invasiveness with a lower probability, or do they want to go straight to the highest technology, which gives them the highest probability? You can't have it both ways. So IUI is often the first line of treatment if the couple is comfortable with the same person's egg source and is carrying the baby as well. If they want to separate those two factors, then they can only do IVF. So that's very important. Secondly, IUI, they need to understand, I don't think everyone understands how inefficient we are when it comes to reproduction, just in general. Success rates with IUI, it's not an efficient process. I mean, success rates for a relatively young patient might be in the range of 10 to 15% at best. And when you tell patients that, they're pretty shocked when they hear that. Well, when you do IVF in that same age group, you might get a pregnancy rate of 50 to 60% every time you put an embryo in. So this is the kind of information physicians need to give to the patient so they can make an informed decision medically. So that's IUI. With IVF, which changes the whole paradigm, the appealing nature, I've seen it, to IVF, is that couple can then decide, well, I'd like to use one patient's eggs, the other patient can carry. And then if they have a second child, they can switch that around. They can decide on whatever ratio they would like to do. IVF allows you to do that. So for me, I have a tendency, and I know I've been critiqued for a little bit, to push the IVF agenda, even though it's more timely, more consuming, more intensity. It gives you a high probability of pregnancy, allows you to have more children, age becomes less of a factor later on, and you can decide to split the source of the eggs versus the uterus. So I think that's very important from a physician point of view. You need to see a physician who has experience in presenting all those options to that couple. But at the end of the day, it's up to the patient to choose what they feel comfortable doing with that information.
Yeah.
So just to finish it off for last minute, if you have someone who's 40 years old, ideally you would rather use the eggs from the younger patient. And so that's where the medical side comes into play. So we get caught up in the legal side, the logistics, but at the end of the day, you have to have the right medical decision and the right medical technology, which has to be state of the art.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more. And I think that there's so much to be said about listening to what your patients want and how they really want to create their family. And I think that's often the time. The first thing I'll ask them is when you're walking in, like, how do you envision your family being created? We have 4 ovaries, 2 uteruses.
Right. You could do any permutation you like. And, Eve, I know you're going to get to that, but if you look at the male, same-sex male couple, it's even more I don't want to say complicated, but the decisions are even more broad, because now you have to use an egg donor. So the genetics is constant, and you can then split the sperm and fertilize half the eggs with one partner and then half the eggs with the other partner. So now when you're placing that embryo into a surrogate, their first child could be genetically from one partner, and the second child can be from the other partner. The egg is a constant. The surrogate is the incubator, basically. So that's very appealing for most male couples, where they then have children, where they have their own genetics and a common denominator in the egg, which is very appealing for many. Now, some only want to use sperm from one partner, and that's fine too, but they need to know all those options.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I have very few male couples who don't split. Like,
Yeah,
I would have to think long and hard to think of a
Mhm.
couple who didn't split and why they didn't split. I would say the overwhelming majority of the male couples that I see prefer like a 50-50 split. And
I
then
agree.
they usually also have a firm idea of whose sperm source they want to use first,
Yes.
and whose sperm source they want to do
Yes.
second.
Yes.
I know typically when we think about egg donation, we don't think about pre-implantation genetic testing, or we don't always think about pre-implantation genetic testing. Can you talk a little bit about what it is and why we might encourage it more when it comes to surrogacy?
I think it's a very important question. It's from a purely physiological point of view, I think everybody needs to realize that many human embryos are actually abnormal. So when the egg and the sperm fertilize, there's a breakup in the egg and the sperm, so that the embryos are abnormal, and it's very age related to the age of the female. So as women get older, there's more fragility in the egg, so you get a higher incidence of abnormal embryos. But what I think people don't realize is, even in a 24-year-old, so that's a young donor, about 25% of those embryos are actually abnormal. That's how the human being works physiologically. So even though it's a low percentage compared to a 40-year-old, it's still a significant number. So a lot of couples still prefer to test those embryos for what we call aneuploidy. So you're looking at the number of chromosomes. You want to make sure the number of chromosomes are correct. So just from an example point of view, if you have 3 chromosome 21s, that's Down syndrome. So you're looking at numerical numbers. So it is controversial, and I think you and I agree on this. It is controversial whether to test a 24-year-old embryo for genetic testing, because the incidence is relatively low. However, I think by testing, it's more efficient. You're not wasting cycles where you might be putting in an embryo that's abnormal. And number two, if I was a surrogate, you take the uncertainty from a surrogate out the equation. A lot of surrogates would want you to genetically test, because they don't want to deal with a high incidence of miscarriages. They don't want to deal with the decision. If for some reason that pregnancy has Down syndrome, do they terminate? They don't terminate. You taking that uncertainty out the equation. So many surrogates today won't even be surrogates unless you genetically test. So I think it's a comfort level on the surrogate side. I think there's a greater efficiency just from an outcome point of view. And anytime you can increase the probability of having a healthier outcome, lowering a miscarriage rate is beneficial. And so that's important, because I think there's an underestimation of the effect of miscarriages, what it can do to patients, both mentally, physically. It's really not a good thing. So if you can reduce that probability, why would you not?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I would say the overwhelming majority, if not all, of my patients who use a surrogate, I strongly encourage them to do
Recommend it.
genetic
Now,
testing.
there's the other, I know it's controversial, but you also have the option of gender selection. So when you do genetic testing, you can know the gender of the embryo. And then it depends on the program, on the patient, on the physician, whether they want to choose gender as a choice as well. And it often becomes more in this country for family balancing. So if you have your first child and you don't know the gender, you might want to, for the second child, decide to use a different gender. So that is an option that couples can have as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, especially for couples that have 2 kids, I will
Right.
say, again, more often I see them choosing the opposite. It's very
Correct.
rare, although not out of the question. And I do have a lot of male couples who feel that they are better suited to parent male children. And it becomes, it's always a conversation about what are the values that are important to each couple that we see and why are they important, and doing our best to meet the needs and the desires of our patients.
But I think that's very important, Eve. At the end of the day, that's my point. It's a matter of choice. You want to present all those options, and the couple will decide based on their own values, their relationship, which way they decide to go. But you need to have all those options for them, and I think that's critical as a physician.
Yeah, and I think when I think about LGBTQ reproduction on the whole, recently the American Society for Reproductive Medicine expanded the definition of infertility. So it typically used to be unprotected intercourse between a man and a woman for 12 months. And now the definition is really the inability to conceive without medical assistance. And so I think from a ability to access care, that expanded definition really allows more LGBTQ couples to have insurance coverage for infertility. I want to touch a little bit also just on the medical aspects of surrogacy, like what makes somebody a good candidate to be a gestational carrier, and what are some of the things that we exclude, or we say like, thanks, but no thanks. I appreciate your trying, but that's not a good pregnancy situation. When do we exclude a gestational carrier?
I mean, it can be individualized from physician to physician and practice to practice. And I think you and I practice similarly in that we don't have rigidity in the way we practice. But when it comes to surrogate, that's one area where I am more rigid than anywhere else in what I do, because it is such a commitment of time and emotion and cost that you really want to be cautious on selecting the surrogate as much as you can. So for me, there are certain guidelines that ASRM, our society, stipulates we have to follow. For example, a surrogate has to have had a child before. She has to be proven. So those kind of things are not even a debate. That's a prerequisite. Personally, for me, I'm concerned about any time there has been some form of manipulation of the uterus, any trauma to the uterus that's done. For example, if someone's had fibroids removed, any surgery, I would be very hesitant in using that surrogate. I think having too many cesarean sections, I've just seen too many cases where the lining doesn't respond, the uterus has scarring in it. So for me, when you start getting about 2 C-sections, I'm very wary of that patient. So I'm going to be extra cautious. If there are obviously medical conditions, if the patient had a bad pregnancy, prematurity, had eclampsia in pregnancy, she is severely hypertensive, you want to exclude all the medical conditions, make sure the uterus is okay, that she's screened psychologically, and then the rest is just a matter of the comfort level with the couple. So for me, those are the 3 critical factors. And then nuances that play a role as well. I tell patients, everybody has a different approach of how close they want to be with a surrogate from a relationship point of view. And that's going to be up to the surrogate and the couple. Some want it very tight where they're very involved, and others want to keep it very much on the periphery. And I think that has to be decided, and that's where the legal side comes in. And I think it's important especially with same-sex male couples, this is a very multidisciplinary approach. I mean, you have many people involved, from nursing coordinators to psychology to legal to finance to the physician involved. It's not a simple process. It takes time. It's expensive. It's exhausting. So from a medical point of view, we need to make sure that's as tight as possible, and we assist in putting all those teams together. And I think because it needs to be done with good medicine, but in an environment that is efficient.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say efficient, and also I find my male couples perhaps to be a little bit more vulnerable in that they haven't been trying to conceive for 12 months. They're not on the same. I think when a hetero couple comes in and they've been trying for 12 months, I often find that the female patient is like all over it. She's been tracking her cycles. She knows what to expect. She has friends that have been through fertility treatment. And a lot of the times with my male couples, they're not, because they haven't experienced the ups and the downs of the 12 months, they're coming in and perhaps don't know exactly what to expect when they walk in the door.
No,
And
that's very important. But but it's a superb population for many reasons. We know that. I mean, it's I think, and I know it's generalizing, compliant, motivated. It's superb results because using eggs that are young. This is our dream patient, using young eggs and a surrogate who's proven. So it's really a superb population from that point of view, both professionally and personally in many ways. But you're right, you have to set expectation like we do every day for all our patients. It doesn't work every time. You want to make sure that expectation is set up
yeah.
front. And that's part of what we do every day.
Yeah. And I think what I enjoy, so I mean, I love taking care of same-sex couples, and where I frame it is it's not the sadness of infertility, it's the joy of family building. But in that joy, it can be a roller coaster. I think as we are getting close to time here, I just want to see if there are any questions that have come through the chat that we can answer. I can't see if there's anything in there. Teri,
Not yet, but feel free to drop one in if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, we can do a few more minutes of conversation and wrap up.
Yeah, I would say, Dr. Kaplan, any words of wisdom to LGBTQ couples who may be thinking about family building?
I would say that you should be very optimistic, that there are choices. There's no reason you should not have a child or more than one. It's just a matter of, like everything in life, it takes time, it's process. You have to go through it. It's not easy. But at the end of the day, I know it's a cliche, that's the rainbow, but there's no reason anyone shouldn't be able to have a baby. It's just a matter of how you get there. And so for me, it's a very, I've seen an evolution in the field of fertility from a medical point of view, where we get incremental changes on a yearly basis, but there are 3 or 4 major dramatic changes we saw that were transformative. I think the progress of the LGBT community as a inherent part of our practices is one of the major evolutions we've seen in our field. It's dramatic. I mean, when I first started as one of the first doing LGBT community in Chicago, there were very few patients. Today, it can be 20 to 30% of some of our practice. To me, that is transformative society-wise. So it is just, everything's there for you to achieve what you want. You just find the right physician, the right center, and then you commit.
Yeah, build your team. Teri, any wisdom, and then I'm going to build upon that just a little bit.
Yeah, I just think, anything is possible. I'll do a little plug for those who are actually on the webinar today or watching it before tomorrow, the 13th. There are 4 bills being presented to the Senate tomorrow. It's the Right to IVF Act, and it's all about access, insurance, coverage to enhance the access for reproductive health for everybody, but particularly for the LGBTQ communities. We know there are anti-discrimination laws out there. So if there is an insurance policy that covers it and they've adopted the ASRM definition that includes everybody, then it's covered. But there are a lot of states that haven't adopted that, a lot of employers that don't provide this coverage. And so the acts going forward tomorrow would help increase that access. So as part of your family building, I would encourage you to get involved with ASRM and Resolve and any other entities that are out there that are advocating for increasing access, because that will make your journey a little bit easier, and it will make the journey for those coming after you easier. We can, help you get there within parameters, but in the current situation, those parameters sometimes are limited and sometimes are very expensive. So we're all working towards making everybody have greater access to having their family.
Thank you. Yeah, my one of my favorite books is The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. And in that book, he talks about brick walls are meant to be broken. And I often hear from some of my LGBTQ patients who are walking in that it feels overwhelming, that they need an attorney, an agency, an egg donor, a surrogate. and the cost can be prohibitive. And so while at the coalition, we cannot fix everything, and we certainly realize that there's a lot of gaps in funding, we do our very best to help with as much as we possibly can. In addition to financial grants, we have grants that will cover PGT that are donated in kind by Natera. We have medications that are donated in kind by EMD Serono. We have partnerships with agencies that will help to reduce some of the costs of family building. And what we often will do, especially for our LGBTQ couples, is we will partner up multiple grants. And so we do our very best to help every person achieve those dreams of having a family. So I just wanted to end on that note, and again, to thank Taryn for all of your coordination in getting this webinar off the ground, to Dr. Kaplan and Teri for lending your wealth of expertise in doing this, and to Ferring Pharmaceuticals for financially supporting the coalition and our educational mission of providing education to the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Eve.